I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Every morning, we awake to a world marvelously alive. Where do we encounter awe and wonder in this world? In animals and plants, in deserts on mountains, in forests, ocean and sky, in history, art and science, in human striving and human kindness. Join us as we quest for the awe and wonder of knowing we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. Your host for this episode is Tenery Taylor.
Joe Hollins is a veterinarian who has sometimes been tasked with making house calls out in the wild, no house in sight. For over a decade, he worked as senior veterinary officer on British territorial islands in the South Atlantic. And it was in this capacity that he was camping out on West Falkland Island all by himself, trying to round up 13 scraggly, starving reindeer.
It was quite extraordinary because these reindeer were on the edge of extinction, really. They shouldn't have been there at all anyway, but we were trying to catch them up so we could move them 100 miles to a much better site. And I'd been there for several days trying to befriend the reindeer.
All part of his job as vet at the end of the earth, as he calls himself in his memoir of that very same name. The book is full of tales starring both wild and tame animals. Now, in my chat with him, I was able to capture stories about saving reindeer, caring for an ancient reptile, and identifying the mysterious killer that plagued a flock of lambs. We started our conversation with those reindeer. You might have noted that if Joe Hollins was camping amid reindeer, his assignment should have placed him up north in the Arctic. But no, he was down near to the South Pole, the land of penguins, not reindeer. We'll explain how these ungulates got to be so far south momentarily. But first, Joe's campsite. His tent was situated outside of a large pen he was building to trap the reindeer.
That morning, I was camping there, and if you can imagine a peninsula, a sort of anvil-shaped peninsula called Rapid Point, and it was deliberately chosen so a deer fence could be put across the neck of the peninsula, because reindeer are, after all, good climbers. It was 1,500 acres. These reindeer, which have a fright-flight reflex, the classic adrenaline thing, and because they're from the Northern Hemisphere and they're attacked by wolves, you only have to flinch or move rapidly and they vanish. You suddenly see they're 100 yards away, quite happily grazing again. It's not as if they're really scared. They just know how to run. So all this effort to try and catch them, we'd created a trap, but it wasn't complete. I got up one morning out of my tent, unzipped the tent. There I was on the neck of the peninsula, lovely sea air, the sort of nice briny atmosphere. All 13 reindeer were sitting down, lying down around my tent, chewing the cud. I could not believe it. So up until then, I was seen as a potential threat or possibly a predator, but they befriended me because I was the candy man. I was bringing food.
What was your candy that you would entice them in with?
Yes, because they're reindeer. They specialize in moss. That's their real candy. They have a special enzyme in their gut to digest moss, the only animal. I didn't have any moss, so I took a whole load of different feeds, cattle nuts for pellets. I tried a hay. It was useless. But I tried on a whim, and I didn't think it would work, molasses sugar beet, because this is down in the Falklands. It just so happened, though, that there was one man who loved his horses who imported sugar beet. You have to soak the stuff, and it does this magic trick of overnight expanding to several times the size. Anybody with a horse that feeds them molasses sugar beet will know this. So I had this molasses sugar beet, which I thought would be useless, but it wasn't. It was nectar to them, absolute nectar. And in fact, I compare it to fly agaric. Fly agaric is that beautiful red and white spotty mushroom you see depicted in so many children's books with gnomes sitting on them. It's actually hallucinogenic, but it is used by the Lap herders to round up the reindeer because they love it. And so they have it in a dried form. I had found my fly agaric, which was a molasses sugar beet. I had a bucket of it. It'd been soaking overnight. So I reached into the tent and grabbed it very gently. I didn't want to spook them. And I walked into, it was literally my Pied Piper moment. I walked into the enclosure we'd made out of cattle hurdles, these great big gates. We tried to make a bottlenecked trap, like a lobster trap, really. And they followed me because they knew I had this bucket of food, good sense of smell. And then I distributed it over the ground and they all came in and started eating it. And then I didn't know what to do because the trap wasn't finished. It had a big hole in it. And also, reindeer climb out. You're meant to shield everything with burlap. Otherwise, they see the horizon and escape. All this was training we'd received from Alaska, by the way, from proper reindeer herders. So it was an incomplete trap. There was a hole in it. And I had the whole herd. And I thought, what do I do now?
You got ahead of yourself.
I did. I got completely ahead of myself.
I want to get to the end of this story, but you said a couple of things. First of all, reindeer in the Falklands. I just want to emphasize that this is not supposed to be. Reindeer are from the northern hemisphere, from the Arctic. The Falklands are in the southern hemisphere, close to Antarctica. How did reindeer end up in the Falklands?
Yeah, you're right. If you look at the Shield of South Georgia, which is quite a large island, British, near the Falklands, you'll see it's got a reindeer on it. And, any zoologist would say, well, that's got to be wrong. The reason is, though, South Georgia became the center of whaling in the 1900s. And that was because of a guy called Carl Larsen, who was famous, actually, for the Larsen Ice Shelf. He was on an expedition, fossil hunting and everything in the Antarctic. And he saw it as the place to establish the whaling industry. A beautiful island. Now, he's Norwegian. And he's got his men down there, and I guess they're a little bit bored. But I've got his lovely original letter where he appeals to the administrator not to harm his reindeer. He brought reindeer down from Norway and established them in South Georgia. So that's how they come to be in the Southern Hemisphere.
So he was just trying to provide a little diversion, a little change in the diet and some sport, probably, right?
Exactly so, and some venison. Yeah, quite right.
So that's South Georgia, but you're on the Falklands.
Yes. Both the Falklands and South Georgia are British overseas territories. South Georgia is a pristine place, an incredible place for the breeding of seals and birds and so on. Now, the reindeer became a problem because of the very few reindeer he took down there, 3 males and I think it was 5 or 6 females, only one stag survived. But believe it or not, they bred up to 7,000. 7,000 reindeer, inevitably ravishing the landscape and damaging the breeding grounds for the penguins and seabirds and the seals. So a decision was made to cull them, to eliminate them completely.
Now, was this just because they were interfering with the native species? I mean, how were they thriving? This is not their natural habitat, and you said they kind of devastated the land. So were they even healthy themselves?
No, and that's a very good point. You can imagine when the numbers reached that enormous extent, they were starving. A lot of them were falling off cliffs trying to reach feed. So there was a welfare issue, as well as the fact, of course, that they were eating all the tussock grass, which provides beautiful clumps for the breeding of the seabirds and the seals, and the moss and the lichen. And that was resulting in soil erosion. So they love moss and lichen. So you're right, it's not a native species. It's meant to be in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's a sad decision, but they realized what they needed to do was eliminate the reindeer in the kindest way possible. And they did do a very thorough job. And since then, I can tell you, it's been remarkable. The area which was affected has really recovered, and breeding numbers for seabirds and so on have gone up, of course. So it was worthwhile.
The invasive reindeer were eliminated from South Georgia Island, where they'd been brought a century before. But before they culled the last of them, conservationists made a decision to save just a few dozen and keep them not on South Georgia, where they'd done such harm to the ecosystem, but on West Falkland Island, which could handle a small herd. And the reason they decided that saving a few reindeer was actually urgent had to do with the tragedy half a world away on the fateful day of April 26th, 1986.
Well, it's an anomaly. It's all because of a very famous nuclear disaster. Chernobyl. Now, the reindeer are all circumpolar, were all irradiated. So the theory was that their genome, their genetics were also irradiated, and the only unirradiated reindeer left in the world were on South Georgia. Now, they were going to be culled, so the Falklands took it on as a task to go and rescue some and take them to the Falklands, because Falklands is already agricultural, so you're not harming a pristine environment. Very beautiful, though, but they spent actually almost £250,000 to go and rescue 60 reindeer.
60? Wow. That's an expensive price per head.
Really expensive.
In their new home on West Falkland Island, the reindeer didn't fare well, and the farmer tasked with managing them couldn't figure out why. Something was killing them. That £250,000 was quickly starting to look like a total loss, but...
The reindeer, of course, are the more important thing, really. You know, the money's irrelevant. The animals are lovely. Well, I was sent out there to see what had happened to them for a start, and I had a very sad time driving my Land Rover over this rather desolate peninsula, which I could see, to be honest, wasn't right. Because I read up on reindeer. They need a bit of shelter, permanent water. They need lichen and moss. And also I could tell, you could just look at land when it's sour land. It was wind blasted and spray blasted by the sea. And I could see in a way it looked deficient. The Falklands suffers a lot of deficiencies anyway. And the reindeer were what we call hat racks. They were bony thin. They had tried to catch the reindeer the year before. They used motorbikes, and they had a ship standing offshore. Motorbikes with reindeer with this fright-flight reflex. I'm not claiming merit, but they vanished. And also, I have to laugh a little bit. They forgot reindeer can swim. Motorbikes can't swim. The reindeer jumped in the sea, and then everybody on the motorbikes went, now what? So they abandoned the effort, which is why I went solo with a tent and with a lot of food and just lived with them to what we'd call habituate them to my presence.
How long did that take?
It actually only took about, I think because they were starving, about 3 or 4 days. I did a couple of veterinary visits while I was at it, so I sort of went backwards and forwards while we built this enormous trap as well from cattle hurdles.
As Joe mentioned earlier, the trap wasn't completely finished, but he had strewn a path of his molassed sugar beets leading up to his tent, which stood just outside the opening to that unfinished reindeer pen, where Joe's Pied Piper moment played out.
I didn't know they'd follow, but yes. But it wasn't finished, so there's this big hole in it anyway.
It had no door.
No, had no door. So I had to drag these gates shut without spooking them. So I did everything in silence. Can you imagine handling this
by yourself?
Heavy, clunky, metallic, by myself, this heavy, clunky, metallic material in absolute silence? And then I still had this gap, which they could have bolted through very easily. But my Land Rover was just nearby, and I crept over and released the handbrake and rolled it back because, well, I needed several things, actually. One, I needed to empty it of everything in it, including the spare tyre, to fill up this gap, which I did. Quietly, again, spare tyre, tools, jacks and equipment, all in silence. I mean, try doing that. And it was very difficult.
I'm trying to picture you, are you just like looking over your shoulder like, did they hear that? Oops, did they hear that?
I'm like a thief at night. You know, I'm just looking all around, checking to see what's going on, watching their body language. But the beautiful thing is, because they gorged themselves on the food I put down, they literally lay down and started chewing the cud. And when they chew the cud, it's almost hypnotic. You know, you see it with cows, their eyes are half closed and the jaw goes from side to side as they crush and mash the food, and they get all the juices and the flavor, and they were just loving it. So, I mean, I got away with it, but it surprised me.
Okay, so what do you do with this kind of like makeshift barricade, and they could get out if they want? I mean, you kind of have to hold them back. Could you call in reinforcements?
Quite right. So the farmer, a lovely guy called Peter Nightingale, who was utterly distressed about the loss of the reindeer, actually. He was at home and no mobile phones, bear in mind, but we had 2-meter radios, VHF radios. So one of the reasons I rolled the Land Rover back was so I could reach the radio, and I called for help. I said, basically, Joe Hollins here on Rapid Point. Anybody out there, over? Anybody out there? And there was just the hiss of the Atlantic, nothing.
Oh.
And then a lovely guy just across the way on Saunders Island actually picked up my call and contacted Peter Nightingale, the farmer, for me. But he was 4 hours in coming. It was quite a long way. And the problem is also that Falklands is peaty. The access was over bogs. And actually, this is the only window in the year when we could even move the reindeer because the bogs had dried out a bit. So he eventually turned up with a tractor and trailer, though, and we built a pen. It was an absolute lesson in Falkland ingenuity. We built a pen out of the cattle hurdles by shrinking the trap, and then we burlapped it, and we used fence wire to wire it all together. We used driftwood as well, blocks of wood to fix it all down, and it made a really good pen.
So you kind of were Frankensteining this on the fly, in the moment. You had to kind of take from the pen and then build this thing on the trailer, right?
That's right. Yes.
Like, I mean, did you practice doing that part before you started this whole process, or you just thought, we'll figure it out when we get there?
Absolutely right. You know, Peter turns up with a flatbed trailer and a tractor, and I said to him, "Where's the pen? We can't put them on a trailer." And he sort of knowingly touched his nose and said, "Just watch." Falklanders are very capable. He knew what he was doing, and I did the biggest suturing or stitch-up job as a vet ever by stitching the burlap over the whole thing using fence wire.
And so this way, they're not bothered. They don't see any horizon. They don't see the road as they're driving, I guess.
You're quite right. We had to remove the horizon from them. And actually, it was almost like they started to submit, I think. They were very weak. And the females were heavily pregnant. It's not a good time to move animals. And actually, you know, there are welfare regulations against it. But of course, in this situation, it was a needs must.
So you said something about they needed to be moved 100 miles. We've got bogs in the way.
Yes.
And I'm imagining that 13 reindeer are going to weigh down this trailer.
Quite
even
right.
If they are in bad shape.
Yep. We'd been working at this all day, and it was more or less dusk when we started to head out, and it took 2 or 3 hours to get back to the settlement. We actually put them into the communal wool shed, shearing shed for the settlement at Hill Cove, and then we overnighted them there. By the next morning, we had a calf, actually, which was slightly problematic because it was a maiden.
Meaning this is her first baby?
Yes, yes,
okay.
And she mismothered it. She wouldn't take it on at all. So the farmer tried to rear it, and unfortunately that one didn't survive. But they are so beautiful, I can't tell you. Great big melting chocolate eyes, lovely. But we had 4 more, one of them on the way down to the new destination from an experienced mother who was happy to stand in the truck and suckle it as well. So that was good news.
How did they fare once they got to their new spot? Who was their caretaker and what was their situation?
So we had a lovely chap called Liam Bernstein, was a devoted farmer. Well, so was Peter Nightingale. But Liam Bernstein had been promised these reindeer, or half of them, for many years. And he had fenced off a beautiful area of the southern tip of West Falkland, Cape Meredith it's called. Complete contrast to Rapid Point. It had lots of permanent water, beautiful rising ridges and cliffs, and an area called 3 Crowns, which were 3 enormous, almost castle turrets, or they looked more like rotting teeth or rather than royal headgear. But because of this, all the rocky outcrops, masses of lichen and moss, the food they love. Also a beach, which gave them access to seaweed. They get a lot of minerals from seaweed, eating seaweed, as well as calcium from eating shells, shell grit and that stuff which is attached to the seaweed. So it was perfect. Still 1,500 acres, same size. But another thing he did, which was brilliant, up in Rapid Point, one of the things I did when I first went there, the bad place, was check their feces, their poo, for worm eggs, because they'd been mixed in with cattle. That was a bit of a no-no, because we know that reindeer are very prone to the parasites of cattle and sheep. And sure enough, not only were they malnourished, but they were riddled with worms. So what Leon had done with his bit of land was got the cattle out 3 or 4 years before. And so it was clean land. It was brilliant, beautiful cliffs, and also very ancient. part of Earth's mantle is there. And he said to me jokingly that he used to get these geologists all the time coming along and chipping away at his property. He said, soon it'll go. But it had that sort of real ancient, primeval feel about it. Biscuit-coloured cliffs with the sea lashing against the weed-stained base, and nothing between there and Antarctica. Quite a beautiful spot. So they thrived there. They did very well indeed. We had 4 babies almost immediately, and so the numbers went up, and now they're well over 80, and they're having to cull a few occasionally for venison. You can't overgraze the land, so fair enough, it works. I tell you, this is the best thing I've ever done, is rescue these reindeer. It's not exaggerating to say rescue as well. It was very touch and go. I'm not claiming credit, only I was very persistent.
So we've got the reindeer in the West Falkland Island, and then we have Joe Hollins. Now, how did you end up down there?
By accident. I've always been a bit of a traveller. I had a good friend from university who got the job down there, and I always envied her address, the Falklands, South Atlantic. To have that in your address is great.
When his veterinary friend with that romantic address needed someone to fill in for her when she was on vacation, Joe jumped at the chance. He was then able to turn that temporary gig into a more long-term assignment. Joe Hollins, or Jonathan as he's formally known, is now retired from veterinary medicine. The story of the Falkland Island reindeer is just one of many other such lively tales, all drawn from the years of his far-flung practice and included in his memoir, Vet at the End of the Earth. In just a moment, he'll share more about his practice, including his care for a celebrity tortoise who shares his name. I'm Tenery Taylor, and this is Constant Wonder from BYU Radio.
Dramatic tensions in life can be overwhelming. Working through them can be well worth it if we see that our efforts are genuinely helping to secure justice, to lift people up who are downtrodden. BYU Radio has a new original podcast that gets right to the heart of life's classic conflicts and tensions. It's called Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor. On this podcast, Taylor, who is a certified mediator with a PhD in psychology, helps real people grapple with real conflicts. From disputations at home to tensions in the workplace or community, conflicts are part of life, but they don't have to ruin it. Each episode reveals strategies for developing better relationships, even when there's disagreement. Learn how to find what's actually at the bottom of a specific kind of interpersonal tension. The podcast's great value comes when you get to witness actual situations with participants being coached through real difficulty by Dr. Taylor. Look for Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor on BYU Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
It's hard to say what turns someone into the adventurous type. Someone who maybe would gladly sign up to camp out with reindeer. But in Joe Hollins' case, it might be argued that the seeds for adventure were sown in his childhood.
I always say to people, you don't know your parents are eccentric until you grow up and you look back. My father was a combustion engineer. It was his official qualification. My mother was a nurse, and they bought a ruin outside of Guildford. Guildford is a sort of classic city, what we call stockbroker belt in the home counties outside of London. Very wealthy area. But this was a ruin on the River Wey, and it was extraordinary. So originally it was a quarryman's cottage, a stone cottage in probably the 1600s. And from then on, it had been built upon. It became part of Braboff Manor. So they built a tower with a coat of arms on it. We had battlements. The whole ground floor was stables, except for the garage, which was a carriage house for the carriages. So the stabling and the carriages for the manor were kept there. It had a moat, and that's because it was built into this big chalk quarry. We had kilns for calcining the chalk. Chalk is calcium carbonate, and it was burnt and calcined to spread on the acid fields to increase its productivity. particularly down in the West Country where the soils are very acid. We also had a big tunnel, and halfway down the drive, we had a dungeon. Would you believe it? Which for kids was fantastic.
I mean, this is just a dream. This is every child's dream. I cannot believe it.
Absolutely. It was great. Had the river to play with as well. So, and we were surrounded by woodland. So it was a great childhood just for tumbling around and learning practicalities. My father had a big workshop as well, and he allowed us just to play in there. And I think that was beneficial too. He let us use his tools and make things. So it was I have to say, in retrospect, a very fortunate upbringing and a happy place to be. I loved that house.
After his work on the Falklands, Joe Hollins was hired as senior veterinary officer on another South Atlantic island, this one quite a bit further north. It's named St. Helena, populated by people referred to as saints.
What I love about islands is they compress humanity into a small space, but also they vary enormously according to their history and cultural background and topography and geography, where they are. So St. Helena's in the tropics, for a start, and it's hugely influenced by a maritime climate. In fact, it's bathed by the southeast trades. That was the main trading route for all the ships coming from the east. No Suez Canal. We take the Suez Canal for granted, but there was no shortcut. And St. Helena is the only island down there. It's very isolated, the second most isolated island settlement in the world, in fact. Still is, of course. But all the ships called in to re-victual because it was a source of fresh water and fruit and vegetables. It's only 47 square miles. It is the pinnacle or tip of a huge volcano that goes down to about 4,000 meters deep. And so we really just live on a tiny tip, but underneath is this Kilimanjaro of the Atlantic, which is quite a nice thought, I always think.
Well, could it ever erupt?
No, that's the good news, because St. Helena was produced by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge so long ago. Well, relatively speaking, not that long ago. It finished erupting 8 million years ago, but the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is parting all the time. I think it's something like an inch a year, and it's been pushed 100 miles off the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So I haven't even felt an earthquake, though I gather occasionally there's a mild tremor. So I shouldn't tempt fate, but no, it's extinct.
Okay.
And actually, it's quite heavily eroded on top. So they reckon it was about 1,500 meters high. Sorry, that's about almost 5,000 feet, but it's half that now. Because of the trading route, it's populated by a real mixture of people, mainly from the east, in fact, particularly from Malaysia and Madagascar. There was slavery, of course. The East India Company essentially owned the island and ran it under a royal charter. And if people don't know, they were massive. They had their own army, their own navy. They were bigger than the crown, but they operated for the crown. Well, they operated for their own means, I think, but with the tolerance of the United Kingdom, the crown. So they populated the island with expats and enslaved people, but also people from Asia. There was also a liberation camp when slavery was ironically abolished by the British, who we were some of the worst slavers. But when we abolished slavery, we meant it and became very dedicated to abolishing all of it. So the Brazilians, Portuguese particularly, were slaving still across the Atlantic, and we were seizing their ships and liberating the slaves. Now, a lot died because they're in a poor state, but some stayed. So you got the African mix in there as well. There was a liberation camp in a valley called Rupert's Valley. There are a lot of graves there. They think about 7,000 or 8,000, actually. And it sounds like we did a bad job, but I gather from reading the contemporary reports that, they would seize these ships and they were handing down skeletal people, really appalling, skeletal people who would sometimes die before they made it to the shore even. And then again, there was a problem because you've got tribes of mini African nations speaking different dialects. The British didn't know really where they came from. So to repatriate them was difficult. You couldn't just dump them on the African coast. They'd be slaughtered by the local tribes. So I think it was a very difficult thing to try to do, and it didn't work 100%. But yes, some stayed, and so you can see that there is African genetics mixed in. But a lot of the saints got straight black hair, which shows the Asian origin. And then we had Boers as well, the South African Boers, the Cape Dutch, if you like. Because of the Boer Wars, we had Boer prisoner of war camps there, and some of them stayed as well. And so you got a real mix. And that makes it such an interesting island. They're lovely people.
When Joe Hollins first arrived in St. Helena in 2009, the only way to access the island was by ship.
A lovely ship called the Royal Mail Ship, the RMS St. Helena, was our lifeline. She was actually the last Royal Mail ship. Everything came on her. She'd take 6 days to get to the island from Cape Town and 6 days to go back. So if you went on holiday, that was 12 days. Then you had your flight to maybe the UK, as in my case. That's another 2 days each way because you never book on the same day because the ship was often delayed. So you're talking about 14 days before you do anything else. But she was such a nice ship because the crew were all islanders. We called them saints. And so I knew them. And there were essentially 2 crews on 6 months at a time. It wasn't a direct swap, but they did 6 months on, 6 months off. And so I knew them as farmers, a lot of them. The senior steward for the captain's table would tell me about the lambs he's got and things like that. It's lovely, lovely. The food was superb, and it was all very formal with first and second sittings, dinner gong, lots of entertainment. The front half was all cargo and the back half was all passengers. Lovely ship.
But getting off a large ship like that was tricky once it came into port at St. Helena.
The only way to get ashore was at the steps, famously called the steps. It is what it says they are. And you're coming off the RMS, and the Saints are really good at controlling the vessel against the steps because it's always surging the sea. So the boat goes backwards and forwards, but they rev the engine, cut the engine. And how do you get ashore from a vessel like that? So there is a bar along the steps with all these heavy gauge ropes hanging down, and you grab onto one and swing ashore. But they always used to make sure everybody was okay, so there'd be helpful hands there, strong arms to grab people.
Now, you might have actually already heard of St. Helena. It was Napoleon's home of exile. But there's another famous resident. He didn't live there at the time of Napoleon. He arrived about 60 years after Napoleon took his last breath. And this celebrity is still there today. His name is Jonathan the Giant Tortoise. Joe Hollins was sporting an image of him on the T-shirt he wore the day we talked by internet call.
This shirt depicts a tortoise for a very, very good reason. Jonathan the Giant Tortoise, which is ironically also my name, Jonathan, not the giant tortoise bit. Jonathan is an extraordinary animal. He's a Seychelles giant tortoise, and he is the oldest known living land animal in the world. I always emphasize land because of Greenland sharks and even corals are older. But the reason we can say that, and he's in the Guinness World Records, is that we have the documentary evidence, which is rather nice. So at the moment we say he's 193. We can't be sure, and he could be over 200. We've taken really the fair minimum that he could be. And that's because we know, fortunately, that he was landed in 1882 fully grown. And fully grown, the experts have confirmed this for us, we didn't make this up, is about 50 years of age. And actually, nicely to confirm that, we have 4 giant tortoises, and one of the other ones, David, in 2010, I measured him at that time, and since he's turned 50, he's stopped growing. He's actually now bigger than Jonathan. He was slightly smaller than Jonathan when I first went there, and he's now an inch or 2 bigger, and he's stopped growing. So that kind of confirms it. So Jonathan, when he was landed, could have been 60 or 70, we don't know, but we've taken it as 50. 193, we're hoping he makes his 200. He's blind with cataracts. He's lost his sense of smell, but he's a very happy animal. He's a gentleman of a tortoise. He's a lovely beast. Weighs about 180, 200 kilograms. That's 400 pounds. So 440 pounds.
And how did he get from the Seychelles to St. Helena?
Quite a lot of giant tortoises were gifted as diplomatic gifts around the world for one very good reason, that they were delicious. There are 2 cohorts of giant tortoises in the world, the Galapagos Islands everybody knows about, and the Indian Ocean giant tortoises. And the reason that they were subjected to possible extinction, and Darwin again had a big role in preventing this, was that they were easily herded and collected and stacked on board boats, and they provided a never-ending source of fresh meat. You know, when mariners in those days were eating pickled pork, salted beef, biscuits with maggots and weevils, instead they had this fresh meat. You don't have to feed or water a tortoise for weeks on end. They store water, quite incredibly, and obviously they store fat for food as well. So it's horrible to contemplate, but they were basically stacked in the holds and eaten. And I think obviously they were novel, and it would make a very good diplomatic gift, which is what happened.
So where does Jonathan live? And does he stay in one place?
Well, more or less. In the old days, they were allowed to roam, but now the car is buzzing with four-wheel drives. They can't. But they have what's called the paddock, with a capital P, which is actually a rather beautifully kept large paddock at about 500 metres in front of the governor's stately home called Plantation, which was built by the East India Company, which is a gorgeous building. It's a real confection of columns and plasterwork, you know, like a glorious Christmas cake, really. Late 1700s, early 1800s, typical of that time. The front of the house stands above the paddock, and there are 4 tortoises there. So it's quite a big roaming area. They've got trees and scrub all around. And we've actually built what we call a tortoise corridor at the bottom end. Looks way out to sea as well from a height. The tortoise corridor is for people, not the tortoises. It's a bit of a misnomer. We didn't want Jonathan to be harassed. He's an important zoological specimen. In the old days, people used to sit on his back and ride him. You know, we're not having that anymore.
So the people need to stay in their lane, is what you're saying.
That's right. So we wanted tourism. We wanted the tourists to see the tortoises. So we created this nice corridor. And actually, the tortoises are usually around there.
So when you first arrived, though, he was not in great shape, as I understand it. Could you kind of describe the shape he was in and what you did to nurse him a bit?
Yeah, I was lucky, really, because we struck on a bit of a miracle. And I've learned a lot about giant tortoises I didn't know. When I arrived, he had reached a period of decline, a vicious circle. So the reason giant tortoises usually really die is something catastrophic. They fall on their backs, or possibly the heart wears out, or they get bladder stones, or they go blind and can't graze anymore. He'd gone blind, and I observed him eating earth. He's lost his sense of smell too. That's important. They have a good sense of smell, but he can't smell a peach if you put it in front of his nose. So he'd gone blind, lost his sense of smell, wasn't eating properly. I'd observed him eating dry leaves, soil, twigs, just grabbing at whatever he could because he couldn't see it. And because of that, he'd become very thin and malnourished. And because of that, his beak, and we call it a beak, his mouth, it's made of keratin. Bear in mind, reptiles and birds are related. Mm-hmm. It goes way back. His beak was crumbly and soft, a bit like cheese, really, or like an infected toenail, you know? So I thought he was basically just, to be honest, dying slowly. And I thought I'd better boost his calories. So we started hand feeding him once a week to boost his calories. What he was suffering from was also a deficiency in those vital drivers of our metabolism: vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. Wow. He rejuvenated. He regrew his beak. He put on weight. He became more active. He started striding around the paddock.
Incredible.
It was a miracle. It was a miracle. I mean, it surprised me more than anybody, I think.
What was that miracle diet?
You shouldn't overdo fruit because it can play havoc with their blood glucose levels and give them diarrhea and so on. But we do feed a lot of fruit, but we bias it more towards the vegetables. Carrots they love, very important source of vitamin D as well, which tortoises need, and vitamin A. And pears, broccoli, we get avocado occasionally, lettuce, cabbage he loves. We did feed him kale once and he more or less spat it out, and I agree with him, but I don't like it at all. But actually, it probably suggests it wasn't a good idea. There is a thing such as kale poisoning in cattle, and, you know, they tend to know. Bananas, they love bananas. Very sticky. They get stuck in the mouth. And I usually use a carrot stick then to comb it off. But the beak is very sharp, so I wear leather gloves in case he grabs me.
Oh, my. You have to tell us about the time that You thought it was the end. I mean, you had nurtured him back to health, but you got a tip from a tourist or maybe a local who was sure that he was in trouble.
I got that dreaded phone call from somebody who was a little bit gleeful about it, to be honest. I think they thought they were involved in a great event, the death of Jonathan. And they had been jogging through the tortoise corridor, and they phoned me up at work and said, Jonathan's dead, that he was stretched out on the lawn. And you can't really imagine a tortoise stretching out. I was scratching my head over this. But he was right that he was stretched out. He also said that he'd been there 2 days, and I don't think that was correct. I rushed down there with my colleague, Ken Henry, and there he was, stretched out on the lawn, eyes closed and everything. And the one thing I did think was, surely they die with their eyes open, It's only in movies that the eyes are closed. So he was stretched out, and he had a very long neck. They have long necks so they can reach up and graze, pull off leaves from scrub, and very long snake-like leg. All his legs splayed out like the collapsed pillars of a Greek temple. He looked dead. But as soon as I touched him, he bolted back into life. Thank goodness. And then I discovered he was sunbathing. They are, of course, poikilotherms. They're cold-blooded. And I now know that they expose as much skin as possible to the sun after a chilly night. It had been a chilly night to warm their blood. And that's what he'd been doing. I don't think he'd been there 2 days. I think he'd just gone back there. That's all. So that was a scare. And funny enough, I got a phone call, I don't know, a year or two later saying the same thing. And I thought, no, he's not dead. But I went down anyway. He was fine.
Should there be reindeer in the Falklands or a giant Seychelles tortoise in St. Helena? Or is that a question you entertain? Or do you just say, they're here, I'm here, let's get to work? Is that part of your job to kind of think about, are animals where they are supposed to be?
It's a good question because I do think about it, and it's a bit of both. It's my job to look after them no matter what or how they got there. Why they're there is always down to humankind, us. We're the species that's interfered. And so if they are mislocated in the wrong place, and if you can't take them back, they have to be cared for, but in the best way possible. But it's an appropriate question because we were looking at, we've lost a tortoise, Myrtle, a few years ago, and we were thinking about should we replace Myrtle, and we don't think we should, really. It's not the correct environment, really. They don't have a beach. They should be at sea level in the Indian Ocean, which is really hot. The winters are quite chilly, actually, on St. Helena because they're at 500 meters, at 1,500 feet. And that's the danger period for Jonathan.
If the nurturing of Jonathan and the rescue of the reindeer make Joe Hollins out to be a hero, well, that may be deservedly so. But he doesn't always get it right the first time. In just a moment, how he learned not to diagnose a patient too hastily. I'm Tenery Taylor, and this is Constant Wonder from BYU Radio.
I've got another podcast to recommend to you from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called The Appleseed. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories for you and your family, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. It's ideal for road trips, bedtime, or any time you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And here's a great side effect of listening to The Appleseed. It has a nearly magical ability to conjure up a whole lot of healthy storytelling right at home, and it often prompts the sharing of precious memories as well. Be sure to catch The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
When Joe Hollins was in veterinary school, he learned an axiom about zebras and horses. On the island of St. Helena, he was reminded of its veracity when treating a flock of lambs. But first, zebras and horses. I asked Joe what the lesson there is.
It's a classic one. A lot of doctors will know it. I should state, where I did my course at Cambridge University, we did 3 years with the medics, which is nice. So we learnt human medicine and pathology, except for anatomy. We did our anatomy, they did theirs. And then for the last 3 years, we did the veterinary stuff. But the classic axiom is don't diagnose zebras when there are only horses. In other words, horses are common, but you're not going to see a zebra in, say, the fields here in England. However, we had a good professor, Professor Jennings, who said it's very flawed, that axiom, because what it's really saying is that common things happen commonly. If you're trying to make a diagnosis, it's really saying look for the common diagnosis. Okay, true to a degree. It's really saying that rare things are rare and you don't see them very often. That's not true. There are lots and lots of rare things, rare conditions, rare diseases and syndromes. And therefore, there are a lot of zebras. They're just different stripes. And if you don't look for the zebras, you never diagnose a rare condition. That's what Professor Jennings said. And he's right. Through my career, I've always tried to keep my mind open to the rare condition. And I've had some interesting rare conditions. As a diagnostician, you've got to have perseverance and curiosity.
Let's talk about the lambs, because you thought you knew what you were seeing, but it was a zebra maybe. So can you kind of tell us who called you out and what was the problem with the lambs?
So this is a classic example of me making a misdiagnosis because I went for the common thing and I didn't see the zebra. Exactly that. I decided it was the horse. I was semi-retired. I was just filling in for emergencies because we didn't have a replacement for me. So this lovely place called Farm Lodge, which is an old planter's house, beautifully kept by Maureen Jonas and Stephen Biggs. They keep sheep there and they rotate their paddocks. So it's quite a confined grazing area. They had a problem with their lambs. When I was called to the farm, they'd already lost 3 or 4. And the story was always the same, that they went off their back legs and started dragging their back legs. And they showed me one. And sure enough, I checked the reflexes and examined the back legs. And it was semi-paralyzed, paraplegic, basically. And so famously, that looked like what's called swayback, which is copper deficiency in growing lambs. It's very common, and it's quite common on the island anyway, very common in the Falklands too. So I said to Steve, it's copper deficiency, and we'll have to get you some licks and stuff like that. And I left. And a week or so later, I had a phone call to say there was another one. Could I come and look at it? I had looked around the lambs when I was there the time before, and there was one that was a bit wobbly on its hind legs. And I said, was it that one? And he said, no, it's another one. And I said, but there were no other ones showing any early symptoms. And this is where I'd gone wrong. I hadn't taken a full history. You have to take a full history. I went back, and his co-worker there, who is his worker actually, said the thing that happened was they got the feed out for the lambs and they ran down towards them to get the feed. And then the lamb he was showing me just suddenly went off its back legs and was paralyzed. And I went, oh my gosh, copper deficiency is slow. It's chronic. It's a creeping paralysis. I hadn't realized this was a sudden paralysis. These lambs were breaking their own backs.
Oh.
Now, there's only one thing that can do that. It can only mean calcium deficiency. And sure enough, I x-rayed the lamb. You could barely see the bones. And actually, you could drive a needle through the bones too. This lamb, by the way, I'd put to sleep. So I x-rayed it as a post-mortem. The bones had turned to papier-mâché. Now, we can all suffer from calcium deficiency, but when you're fully grown, we have a gland in our neck called the parathyroid, which keeps your blood levels of calcium within very confined limits, because too much, you can die. Too little, you can certainly die. And so nature gave us a gland to control it precisely, very nicely, the parathyroid. And what it does, if you're a bit low on calcium, is it mines it from your bones. It's a temporary measure, but it stabilizes the calcium levels beautifully until you get some more from your food. With a growing lamb with a high requirement for calcium because they're building a skeleton, if the food is deficient in calcium, there is no other source. And the parathyroid mines the bones, which are trying to grow, until they basically become papier-mâché. And it's called nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. It's a hell of a mouthful. Nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. Fortunately, I knew it because I'd seen one other case in kittens, of all things, Burmese kittens.
Oh my.
In fact, I diagnosed it for a colleague who'd never seen it before. We had a breeder who thought she knew the best thing to do ignoring all the excellent cat foods which are well-researched that are out there, and was feeding her kittens raw meat because she said cats are carnivores, obligate carnivores, and they eat meat. Well, they eat meat and bones and organs, actually, so that's where they get all their minerals from. Meat itself is low in calcium. And my colleague showed me this x-ray of a kitten that had become paralyzed. And I said, did you ever expose the x-ray? Because the skeleton's very faint. And then I saw what's called a folding fracture, is the vertebrae had literally folded. They say it's like a wet cardboard tube and you press at each end. They don't even break, they fold up. So I knew the condition and I knew I'd misdiagnosed. But I sorted it. So it's very acid there. And I went and got some. Actually, we've got some coral sand. We have no coral, but from a former age, we have windblown coral sand called Aeolian sands, which Darwin himself noted, and which I'd used to give to our chickens, our egg-laying chickens, to strengthen their eggshells. And I'd done an experiment where I dissolved it in acid to see how much of it was calcium carbonate and how much of it was ordinary volcanic sand, and I came up with 75%. And only when I was researching my book did I find Darwin did the same thing. He was only there 4 days and came up with the figure 70%. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, I'm not gonna quibble with Darwin over 5%. He's going to be right. Anyway, we poured the sand into the water troughs so that the acid water would eat away at the sand and release calcium into their water. And the problem stopped, which is good.
Oh, that's so great. In the book, you say that perhaps the reason you misdiagnosed these lambs is that you were kind of preoccupied. You say you were semi-retired. You were preoccupied with your retirement project, Rose Cottage. Tell us about Rose Cottage.
Rose Cottage is lovely. It's not a cottage. I have 3.5 acres in the cloud forest. It has a massive ruin on it, built by the son-in-law of the secretary of the East India Company. A beautiful ruin, actually. And when I got hold of it, a jungle. It's taken me years to clear this jungle. I have something like 300 banana trees. I have masses of coffee, trees 40 or 50 feet high, which is no good. So I had to cut them down, but they've rebushed now. So we're hoping to get some beans quite soon. And I also have lots of New Zealand flax because it was a flax farm. Flax makes string. And St. Helena had the contract with the British Post Office to produce string up until the 1960s. And they turned a lot of the island into flax plantations, sadly. Because we actually have a lot of endemic plants. And they do call it a mini Galapagos. 30% of all endemic species in all UK territory, including the United Kingdom. And it's only 47 square miles. So that's colossal. And I have several on this piece of land which I nurture and love. I have a lovely spider, beautiful, called the golden sail spider, which has a body which looks like a triangular gold ingot. It's beautiful. And quite a few ferns. And so it's a very special place.
So I'm speaking with you. You're in England, and you still have big plans for Rose Cottage. You are retired now?
Yes, theoretically.
I just have this feeling, though, if somebody has an emergency with an animal, you're going to be there.
Well, I just consulted with my neighbour here in the UK over their dog and my other neighbour about their cat. And actually, just before I left St. Helena, I had to amputate a cat's tail. So I'm still fully registered, just in case. You're quite right.
Well, how do you decide where you're going to be? How do you split your time?
Really, what I'm trying to do now, I loathe winters. I hate the British winter. It's awful. I love the British summer, these lovely long days we're having at the moment with heat waves. So I'm trying to be a swallow. In other words, the Southern Hemisphere summer and then the Northern Hemisphere summer. If I can do that, if I can work that, it'll be good.
Joe, or Jonathan Hollins, is the author of Vet at the End of the Earth. This episode was produced by me, Tenery Taylor, with help from Jenna McMartin and Lily Jensen. Sound design by Ted Kim. If you like what you're hearing, please leave us a 5-star rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform. Occasionally, we like to read a review on the air, and here's one from Bob McCord. Great energy in every episode. I listened to 3 episodes on a road trip today, loved each one, and I learned a lot. Thanks, Bob. We really appreciate it. Reviews like that help us get our stories out to more listeners. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.